There's a particular kind of person who's very good at continuing. They show up, they manage, they handle what needs handling, they answer when called, they function when required, and they keep the exterior so consistently together that the people around them rarely think to ask what's happening underneath. And underneath, if you ask them honestly at 2 a.m, when the performance has finally been set down, they would tell you something they have difficulty admitting in daylight. They don't really know what they need. Or they know distantly, but the knowing has become so theoretical that acting on it feels almost impossible. The need is there. They just can't quite reach it anymore. This is what happens when emotional needs go unmet for long enough. Not drama, not collapse. Something quieter and harder to name. A slow, interior narrowing. This video is about what that narrowing actually is, what it does to the body, the mind, and the sense of self, and why understanding it is the first step towards something different. Before we can talk about what happens when emotional needs go unmet, we need to be clear about what they are. Because the word need has been quietly downgraded in most cultures. We accept physical needs without argument. You need water, you need sleep, you need food. These are not preferences, they are requirements, and the body enforces them with clarity. Ignore them long enough, and the consequences are unambiguous. Emotional needs operate the same way. The evidence for this has been accumulating for decades. Abraham Maslow, whose hierarchy of needs is perhaps the most widely known framework in modern psychology, placed belonging, esteem, and self-actualization alongside physical survival, not as bonuses, but as structural requirements of a functioning human life. What is less often cited is his later work, in which he argued that the failure to meet psychological needs produces what he called deficiency motivation, a state in which the person is no longer moved by genuine desire, but by the chronic sensation of lack. You stop reaching toward things. You start trying to fill holes. The emotional needs that matter most, connection, being seen and known, the sense that your inner life is valid, space to express what you genuinely feel, are not indulgences. They are the conditions under which a human being remains intact. When those conditions are consistently absent, the self doesn't simply wait patiently. It adapts. The body is the first to know when something essential is missing. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio spent decades studying the relationship between emotion and cognition, and his findings overturned a long-held assumption that reason and emotion are separate systems, with emotion as the less reliable one. What Damasio demonstrated is the opposite. Emotion is not the noise in the signal. It is the signal. The body's emotional responses generate what he called somatic markers, physical sensations that guide decision-making, direct attention, and communicate constantly what the organism needs. When those needs go unmet, the somatic markers don't stop. They escalate. Persistent low-level fatigue that rest doesn't resolve. A tightness that lives in the chest or the throat. The inability to feel genuine pleasure. Not depression exactly, but a flatness, a dimming of response. Appetite changes. Sleep that doesn't restore. A body that is technically functioning and quietly asking, through every available channel, for something that isn't coming. Most people interpret these signals as evidence that something is wrong with their body, or that they need to push harder, or that this is simply what life feels like. Very few think, my emotional needs have been asking for something, and I have not answered. Here's the part that makes this so difficult to change. Most people who ignore their emotional needs didn't decide to. They learned to. and the learning happened early enough that it no longer feels like a choice. Children who grow up in environments where emotional needs are consistently unmet, where expressing a feeling was met with dismissal, discomfort, or punishment, do not conclude that their needs are wrong. They conclude that expressing them is dangerous, and they begin to stop. The psychoanalyst Alice Miller documented this process with extraordinary precision. She described how gifted, sensitive children in particular learn to suppress their emotional reality in order to maintain the love and approval of the adults they depend on. The child doesn't lose the feeling. They lose the permission to have it. And here's what makes this so persistent into adulthood. The nervous system continues to operate as if the original conditions still apply, as if expressing a need will still produce the original consequence: withdrawal, disapproval, conflict, loss of connection. So the adult continues to dismiss the signal, to tell themselves they're fine when they're not, to minimize, to defer, to find someone else's needs more urgent than their own. Not because they are weak, not because they don't deserve better, but because the part of them that learned to ignore the need is still protecting the part that first had it. The consequences of chronic emotional self-neglect are not always dramatic. That is precisely what makes them so easy to miss. Over time, the person who consistently overrides their emotional needs begins to lose access to them. The signal that was suppressed enough times starts to arrive more faintly. The capacity to identify what you feel, what psychologists call emotional granularity, diminishes. You know you're uncomfortable. You can't say more than that. The philosopher and psychologist Eugene Gendlin spent decades studying what he called the felt sense, the bodily, pre-verbal experience of meaning and emotion that exists before language finds it. His research found that people who had lost touch with this felt sense, who could not locate or describe their inner experience with any specificity, were significantly less able to resolve psychological distress, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they had lost the instrument through which resolution moves. You cannot resolve what you cannot feel. You cannot ask for what you cannot name. And alongside this internal narrowing comes something else, a slow withdrawal from the things that once mattered, relationships that feel increasingly effortful, creative or intellectual passions that seem to have quietly receded, a sense, hard to articulate, that you're going through the motions of a life rather than living one. This is not depression in the clinical sense, though it can shade into it. It is what happens when the self has been running on obligation for long enough that it has forgotten what it actually wants. Reversing this doesn't begin with action. It begins with attention. The first and most important step is simply to stop treating the signal as inconvenient, to pause when the body speaks, the tightness, the flatness, the low-grade resistance you've been explaining away, and to ask, without judgment, what is this telling me? Not to fix it immediately, not to perform emotional processing, just to acknowledge that something is there, that it is real, that it belongs to you and is attempting, in the only language available to it, to communicate something worth hearing. The philosopher Iris Murdoch wrote about what she called unselfing, the capacity to turn attention away from the ego's constant demands and towards something more real. She argued, paradoxically, that genuine attention to oneself, not self-obsession, but honest self-perception, requires the same quality of presence that attention to another person does. Most people who have spent years ignoring their emotional needs have become genuinely good at attending to others. They bring real presence, real care, real perceptiveness. The practice is turning that same quality of attention inward, not instead of caring for others, alongside it. Your emotional needs are not asking you to stop. They are not asking you to fall apart or to put everything else down or to suddenly prioritize yourself at the expense of everything you care about. They are asking, with the patience of something that has been waiting a long time, for acknowledgement. The tightness in your chest knows something. The flatness that arrives after too many days of pure obligation knows something. The longing for something you can't quite name knows something. Those signals are not noise. They are the most honest communication your inner life is capable of. They deserve to be heard, not all at once, not with grand gesture, just the next time one arrives, with a moment of genuine attention instead of the automatic override. That's enough to begin. I want to ask you something honest. When was the last time you asked yourself what you actually need and waited long enough to hear the answer? Leave it in the comments. That question, taken seriously, is the beginning of something important. If this series is finding you at the right time, subscribing means the next video reaches you too. There's more coming.